The train car fell silent as conductor Harvey Brennan pointed his finger at the woman in seat 14B. What happened next would change 3 lives forever and prove that sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the most extraordinary destinies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Denver station platform as Margaret Rose Whitfield clutched her worn leather satchel and stepped toward the gleaming silver passenger car. At 28, she had learned to navigate the world with quiet dignity despite the whispers and stares that seemed to follow her everywhere. Today was different, though. Today she was finally going home to Copper Creek, Montana, after 3 years of working as a seamstress in the city. Margaret had saved every penny for this train ticket, carefully counting and recounting the bills, until she had enough for a seat on the Mountain Star Express. The journey would take 2 days, but it meant she could finally see her younger sister Emma's wedding and meet the rancher who had captured her heart. As she approached the train car, Margaret noticed the way other passengers glanced at her, their eyes quickly darting away when she met their gaze. She had grown accustomed to this dance of avoidance, this careful choreography of judgment that played out wherever she went. Her dress, a deep blue wool that she had sewn herself, was impeccably tailored and pressed, but she knew that wouldn't matter to some people. The conductor, a thin man with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, stood at the car entrance checking tickets. Harvey Brennan had been working the rails for 32 years, and in his mind he had seen every type of passenger there was to see. When Margaret approached with her ticket extended, he barely glanced at the paper before his eyes settled on her with unconcealed disapproval. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification with that ticket," Harvey said, his voice carrying across the platform louder than necessary. Margaret fumbled in her satchel for her papers, aware that other passengers were beginning to stare. "Of course, sir, here you are." Harvey examined the documents with exaggerated care, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "Miss Whitfield, it says here you purchased a standard seat ticket." "Yes, sir, that's correct." "Well, I'm afraid there might be some confusion about the seating arrangements." Harvey's voice grew more authoritative, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who had begun to gather around the scene. "You see, the standard seats are designed for passengers of average size." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I assure you, sir, I will fit perfectly fine in my assigned seat. I've traveled by train before." A well-dressed woman with a feathered hat whispered something to her companion, and Margaret caught the words, "How embarrassing," carried on the morning breeze. More passengers had gathered now, some pretending to read newspapers, while obviously listening to every word of the exchange. Harvey shook his head slowly, as if genuinely sorry about what he was about to say. "I'm afraid I can't allow you to board, miss. Company policy states that passengers who cannot fit comfortably in standard seating must purchase 2 tickets. It's a matter of safety and comfort for all our travelers. But I only have 1 ticket because I only need 1 seat," Margaret replied, her voice beginning to shake despite her efforts to remain calm. "I've made this journey before on other lines, without any problems. Well, this is the Mountain Star Express, and we have standards to maintain." Harvey handed her documents back to her with a dismissive gesture. "I suggest you contact our ticket office about purchasing an additional seat for the next departure." Margaret stared at the conductor in disbelief. She had spent months saving for this single ticket, working extra hours at the seamstress shop, skipping meals, mending her own clothes instead of buying new ones. The idea of purchasing a second ticket was not just financially impossible, it was humiliating beyond measure. "Sir, I don't understand. My ticket is valid, and I've done nothing." "Wrong. I have every right to board this train." Harvey's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the train car. You're holding up the boarding process for other passengers." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and Margaret could feel dozens of eyes upon her. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few displayed the cruel satisfaction that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, to melt into the wooden planks of the platform and escape this nightmare. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing murmur of the crowd. "I just want to go home to see my sister get married." Harvey remained unmoved. "Rules are rules, miss. Now I'm going to have to ask you to move along before I call for assistance." Just as Margaret felt tears beginning to well in her eyes, a deep voice cut through the crowd like a knife through. "Silk, excuse me, conductor. What seems to be the problem here?" Everyone turned to see a tall man pushing through the gathered passengers. He wore a black hat tilted at just the right angle, a clean white shirt with a leather vest, and boots that had seen honest work but were well cared for. His dark hair curled slightly at the collar, and his green eyes held an intensity that made people instinctively step aside as he approached. This was Jake Morrison, though Margaret didn't know his name yet. At 34, Jake owned one of the largest cattle ranches in Colorado Territory, but he wore his success with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned everything through hard work rather than inheritance. He had been visiting Denver on business, finalizing a contract to supply beef to the railroad company, ironically, the same company whose conductor was now treating a passenger with such disrespect. Harvey straightened his shoulders, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Nothing that concerns you, sir, just a ticketing issue that needs to be resolved." Jake's eyes moved from the conductor to Margaret, taking in her distressed expression and the way she clutched her ticket and papers. He had arrived at the platform just in time to hear the tail end of the conversation, and what he had heard made his blood boil. "I couldn't help but overhear," Jake said, his voice remaining calm but carrying an edge of steel. "It sounds like this lady has a valid ticket and you're refusing to let her board." "The lady doesn't meet our seating requirements," Harvey replied, puffing up his chest slightly. "Company policy clearly states—" "I know what company policy states," Jake interrupted, smoothly. "I also know that railroad companies are required by federal law to provide service to all paying customers who conduct themselves in an orderly manner. This lady appears to be doing exactly that." Margaret looked up at this stranger, who had stepped forward to defend her, wondering who he was and why he would involve himself in her troubles. She had learned long ago not to expect help from strangers, especially men who looked like they had never faced a day of hardship in their lives. Harvey's face was beginning to flush red. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is railroad business, and I'm going to have to ask you to step aside and allow me to do my job." "Your job is to check tickets and help passengers board the train," Jake replied evenly, "not to humiliate paying customers in front of a crowd." The tension on the platform was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other passengers had formed a loose circle around the confrontation, some whispering among themselves, while others watched in fascination. Margaret wished the ground would open up and swallow her whole. Harvey decided to take a different approach. "Look, mister, I don't know who you think you are, but I've been working for this railroad for over 30 years, and I know the rules. This woman cannot board my train without purchasing an additional ticket." Jake reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. "How much for a second ticket?" Margaret's eyes widened. "No, sir, you don't understand. I can't accept. The next departure isn't until Thursday," Harvey said with satisfaction, "and it's $12 for a standard seat." Without hesitation, Jake counted out $12 and handed it to the conductor. "There, problem solved." Harvey stared at the money in his hand, clearly frustrated that his plan to embarrass Margaret had been thwarted. Fine, but she'll need to sit in seats 14B and 14C. That won't be necessary, Jake said calmly. The lady can have my seat in the first-class car. I'll take seat 14C. Now Harvey was truly flustered. Sir, you can't just give away your first-class seat. There are regulations. Are there regulations against passengers voluntarily changing seats? Jake asked, his eyebrows raised in mock curiosity. Harvey opened and closed his mouth several times, looking like a fish gasping for air. Finally, he managed to sputter, "Well, no, but—" Then it settled. Jake turned to Margaret and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, if you'd allow me to escort you to your seat." Margaret stared at this stranger who had just spent $12, more than she made in a week, to help her board a train. She had never experienced such kindness from someone she had never met, and she wasn't sure how to respond. I don't know what to say," she managed. "No need to say anything, Mom. Sometimes we all need a little help from our fellow travelers." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Jake offered his arm to escort her up the steps, Margaret noticed something she hadn't seen before in the eyes of the people watching them. Instead of judgment or pity, she saw something that looked almost like admiration. Not for her, necessarily, but for the quiet drama that had just played out before them. Harvey had no choice but to step aside and allow them to board, though he made a show of checking his pocket watch and muttering about delays. As Margaret climbed the steps to the train car, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being protected, of having someone stand up for her without expecting anything in return. The first-class car was a revelation of luxury Margaret had never imagined. Rich burgundy velvet seats faced each other across polished wooden tables, and brass fixtures gleamed in the morning sunlight streaming through spotless windows. Other first-class passengers looked up with mild curiosity as Jake led her to his seat, but no one said anything about the unusual arrangement. "This is too much," Margaret said softly as Jake gestured for her to sit down. "I can't possibly accept your seat. You've already done more than enough." Jake smiled, and Margaret noticed how the expression transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable. "Ma'am, I've spent the last week in stuffy hotel rooms and even stuffier business meetings. I'm looking forward to stretching my legs in a regular seat and watching the countryside go by. You'd actually be doing me a favor." As the train began to move and Denver Station slowly disappeared behind them, Margaret found herself in the surreal position of traveling in luxury she could never have afforded, surrounded by the kind of comfort she had only imagined. But more than the physical luxury, she was overwhelmed by the kindness of a stranger who had stepped forward when no one else would. She didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter would change everything, not just for her, but for the mysterious Cowboy who had just turned her world upside down with a simple act of human decency. As the Mountain Star Express carried them both toward an uncertain future, neither Margaret nor Jake could have imagined the extraordinary journey that lay ahead. The first few hours of the journey passed in uncomfortable silence. Margaret sat in the luxurious first-class seat, acutely aware that she didn't belong among the well-dressed businessmen and society ladies who occupied the car. She kept her hands folded in her lap, afraid to touch anything that might betray her unfamiliarity with such opulence. Meanwhile, Jake had settled into seat 14C in the standard car, where he struck up conversations with fellow travelers with an ease that Margaret envied. Through the connecting door, she could occasionally hear his warm laughter mixing with the voices of other passengers, and she wondered what kind of man could move so effortlessly between different worlds. As the train wound through the Colorado mountains, Margaret found herself studying her reflection in the window. The woman, looking back at her, had tired eyes and worry lines that seemed deeper than her 28 years warranted. She had always been larger than other women, even as a child, but it was only in recent years that the world had seemed to become increasingly cruel about it. A soft knock on the seat beside her interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a woman about her own age, with auburn hair and kind brown eyes, wearing a traveling dress of forest green wool. "Excuse me, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I'm Catherine Hartwell," the woman said with a warm smile. "I couldn't help but notice you're traveling alone, and I thought you might enjoy some company." Margaret hesitated. Experience had taught her to be wary of strangers who seemed too friendly, especially well-dressed women who might be approaching her out of curiosity rather than genuine kindness. "I'm Margaret Whitfield," she replied cautiously. Catherine settled into the seat across from her without invitation, but somehow the gesture felt companionable rather than presumptuous. "I witnessed what happened at the station this morning. That conductor was absolutely dreadful. I've half a mind to write a letter to the railroad company about his behavior." Margaret felt her cheeks burn. "You saw that?" "I'm afraid quite a few people did, but what I saw was a paying passenger being treated shamefully and a gentleman who stepped in to right a wrong. That man who helped you, is he a friend of yours?" "No, I'd never met him before today. I still don't even know his name." Catherine's eyebrows rose with interest. How mysterious. A knight in shining armor who rides to your rescue and then disappears into the crowd. It sounds like something out of a novel. "He didn't disappear," Margaret said, glancing toward the connecting door. "He's sitting in the next car. He gave me his first-class seat." Even more intriguing. A mysterious gentleman who not only defends your honor but sacrifices his own comfort for yours. My dear, you've stumbled into quite the adventure." Margaret shook her head. "It's not an adventure. It's just a kind gesture from a stranger. I'm sure he's forgotten all about it by now." Catherine leaned forward with a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, my dear, you clearly don't understand men very well. A man doesn't spend $12 on a complete stranger and give up his first-class accommodations without a very good reason." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Margaret Whitfield, that your mysterious cowboy is quite taken with you, whether he realizes it yet or not." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Mrs. Hartwell, I think you've been reading too many romance novels. Men like him don't notice women like me, except to step over us when we're in their way." Catherine studied Margaret's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You know, I used to think the same way about myself. I was convinced that no man would ever want a woman who was too tall, too opinionated, and too fond of books. I nearly turned down my husband's first invitation to dinner because I was certain he was asking me out of pity." And was he? Goodness, no. It turned out he had been trying to work up the courage to speak to me for months. He later told me that what first caught his attention was the way I defended another woman from some gossiping ladies at a church social. He said he knew right then that I was the kind of woman he wanted to spend his life with. Margaret looked skeptical. "That's a lovely story. But it doesn't change the fact that most people see me as an object of ridicule rather than admiration. Most people, perhaps, but not everyone. And certainly not the man who just spent his own money to ensure you could travel in comfort and dignity." Before Margaret could respond, the connecting door between cars opened and Jake appeared. Several passengers looked up as he made his way through the first-class car, his presence somehow managing to command attention without effort. He approached their seats with the same quiet confidence he had displayed at the station. "Ladies, I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I wanted to check on you, Miss Whitfield, and make sure you're comfortable." Catherine stood immediately. "Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison." "Mr. Morrison, I'm Catherine Hartwell. I was just telling Miss Whitfield what a fortunate thing it was that you were at the station this morning. Jake's eyes moved to Margaret, who was looking everywhere except at him. "I hope the seat is satisfactory, ma'am. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask. It's perfect, thank you," Margaret managed. "Too perfect, really. I feel like I'm sitting in someone else's life." "Well, for the next day and a half it is your life," Jake replied. "No point in feeling guilty about a little comfort." Catherine, who had been watching this exchange with growing interest, suddenly announced, "Well, I think I'll take a walk through the other cars. Stretch my legs a bit. Mr. Morrison, perhaps you'd like to sit and chat with Miss Whitfield. I'm sure you both have interesting stories to tell." Before either of them could protest, Catherine had gathered her things and swept away, leaving Jake and Margaret alone in the luxurious car. Jake settled into the seat Catherine had vacated, and Margaret noticed how he seemed to fill the space naturally, as if he belonged there. "Mrs. Hartwell seems like a determined woman." "She's certainly that," Margaret agreed. "She's been trying to convince me that you're some sort of romantic hero from a storybook." Jake laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. "I'm afraid Mrs. Hartwell might be disappointed to learn that I'm just a cattle rancher from Colorado who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "A cattle rancher?" Margaret looked at him with new interest. "I wouldn't have guessed. You seem so, what, refined, I suppose. Educated. Most of the ranchers I've known back home are rough around the edges." "Well, I wasn't always a rancher. I studied law back east before I came out to Colorado Territory. Turns out I prefer working with cattle to working with lawyers. They're more honest, for one thing." Margaret smiled, and Jake noticed how the expression transformed her entire face. "What brought you west?" "Adventure, mostly, and the chance to build something of my own. My father wanted me to join his law practice in Boston, but I couldn't see myself spending my life in courtrooms and offices. I wanted to work with my hands, to see the results of my labor in something real and tangible." "And do you see the results, I mean?" Jake's face lit up with enthusiasm. "I've got 3,000 head of cattle on 20,000 acres of the most beautiful land you've ever seen. Mountains on one side, rolling grassland as far as the eye can see on the other. There's a stream that runs right through the middle of the property, and in the spring the whole valley fills with wildflowers." Margaret found herself leaning forward, caught up in his obvious passion for his work. "It sounds wonderful. Do you work it all yourself?" "I've got a crew of 12 men, good men who know cattle and horses. But I'm out there with them every day, and I know every corner of that ranch like the back of my hand. You must love it very much." "I do. But—" Jake paused, as if uncertain whether to continue. "But sometimes it gets lonely out there. A man can have all the land and cattle in the world, but without someone to share it with, it can feel pretty empty." Margaret felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite identify. "Surely a man like you has no shortage of companionship." Jake met her eyes directly. "There's a difference between companionship and partnership, Miss Whitfield. I've known plenty of women who were interested in what I could provide for them, but very few who seemed interested in sharing the work and the dreams that come with ranch life." "What kind of woman would you want to share it with?" The question slipped out before Margaret could stop herself, and she immediately felt her face flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, that was too personal." "No, it's a fair question." Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the passing landscape. "I suppose I'd want someone who wasn't afraid of hard work, who could find beauty in simple things, someone who could see the potential in a place rather than just what it lacks, someone with backbone enough to stand up for what's right, even when it's not easy." Margaret followed his gaze out the window. "That sounds like someone very special." "I think she'd have to be. Ranch life isn't for everyone. It means being miles from the nearest town, dealing with unpredictable weather, working from dawn to dusk during certain seasons. A woman would have to be pretty remarkable to choose that life voluntarily. or pretty desperate," Margaret said quietly. Jake turned back to her with a puzzled expression. "What do you mean?" Margaret realized she had revealed more than she intended. "Nothing, really. I just meant that sometimes people make choices based on circumstances rather than preferences." "Is that what you're doing? Traveling based on circumstances rather than preference?" Margaret hesitated. There was something about Jake Morrison that invited honesty, but she had learned to be cautious about revealing too much about herself to virtual strangers. "I'm going home to Montana for my sister's wedding," she said finally. "I've been working in Denver for 3 years, and it's the first time I've been able to afford the trip back." 3 years is a long time to be away from family. Yes, it is, but I needed to find work, and there were more opportunities in the city. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a seamstress. I work for a dressmaker who caters to wealthy ladies. The pay isn't much, but it's steady work, and I'm good at it." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That explains the excellent construction of your dress. I noticed the quality of the workmanship back at the station." Margaret looked down at her dress in surprise. "You noticed that? My mother was a seamstress before she married my father. She taught me to appreciate fine needlework. That dress is beautifully made, the stitching is perfect, and the fit is flawless." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. No one had ever complimented her workmanship before, at least not someone who understood what went into creating a well-made garment. "Thank you," she whispered. "I made it myself." "Then you're very talented. Have you ever considered starting your own business?" Margaret laughed, but again there was no humor in it. "Mr. Morrison, women like me don't start businesses. We're lucky to find work at all." "What do you mean, women like you?" Margaret gestured vaguely at herself. "You know perfectly well what I mean. You saw what happened at the station. That's how the world sees me." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Miss Whitfield, what happened at the station had nothing to do with who you are as a person. That conductor was a small-minded man who chose to exercise what little power he had in a cruel way. His behavior was a reflection of his character, not yours. That's kind of you to say, but it's not kind, it's true. In the few hours I've known you, I've observed that you're intelligent, articulate, talented and gracious under pressure. Those are the qualities that matter, not whatever arbitrary standards some people choose to apply." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "Why are you saying this?" "Because it's true, and because I suspect very few people have bothered to tell you so." The train whistle blew, signaling their approach to the next station. Jake stood and adjusted his hat. "We'll be stopping for about 20 minutes to take on water and supplies. Would you like to stretch your legs on the platform?" Margaret shook her head quickly. "No, thank you. I'd rather stay here." Jake seemed to understand her reluctance to face another crowd of strangers. "Of course, I'll be back shortly." As he walked away, Margaret pressed her face to the window and watched him stride across the station platform with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. She wondered what it would be like to move through life with such assurance, to believe that you belonged wherever you chose to be. When Jake returned, he carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that he had somehow acquired during the brief stop. "I thought you might enjoy these," he said, offering them to her. "They reminded me of the flowers that grow on my ranch in spring." Margaret accepted the flowers with trembling hands. No man had ever given her flowers before, not even her father, who had died when she was 16. "They're beautiful," she managed. "Thank you." As the train pulled away from the station and continued its journey through the mountains, Margaret held the wildflowers in her lap and tried to make sense of what was happening to her. 24 hours ago, she had been Margaret Whitfield, invisible seamstress, a woman the world seemed determined to overlook or ridicule. Now, she was sitting in a first-class train car, holding flowers from a handsome rancher who seemed to see something in her that she had never seen in herself. It was too much to hope for, too good to be true. But as the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows and Jake Morrison settled back into his seat with that easy smile, Margaret allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to be the kind of woman someone like him could love. Night fell across the mountain landscape like a velvet curtain studded with diamonds. The train had crossed into Wyoming territory, and the dining car buzzed with the quiet conversations of passengers enjoying their evening meal. Margaret had declined Jake's invitation to join him for dinner, claiming she wasn't hungry, though the truth was, she couldn't bear the thought of enduring more stares in the crowded dining car. Instead, she remained in her seat, watching the darkness rush past the window and thinking about the extraordinary day she'd experienced. The wildflowers Jake had given her were arranged in a water glass provided by the porter, their simple beauty somehow making the luxurious car feel more like home. Catherine Hartwell returned from dinner with her cheeks flushed from wine and her eyes bright with curiosity. "My dear Margaret, you missed quite the spectacle in the dining car." "What kind of spectacle?" Catherine settled into her seat with obvious relish. "Your Mr. Morrison caused quite a stir. He was seated at a table with some Denver businessman and his wife, the Kingsleys, I believe, and the conversation became rather heated." Margaret felt a knot form in her stomach. "How is he?" Well, Mrs. Kingsley began making some rather pointed comments about the declining standards of passenger rail travel. She seemed to be under the impression that certain types of people were being allowed to travel in accommodations they couldn't properly afford. The knot in Margaret's stomach tightened. "I see. Oh, but that's where it gets interesting." Mr. Morrison listened politely for a few minutes, then calmly informed Mrs. Kingsley that he had personally ensured a fellow passenger was able to travel in the comfort she deserved, and that anyone who had a problem with his actions was welcome to discuss it with him privately. Margaret buried her face in her hands. "He was defending me again. How mortifying! Mortifying, my dear girl, it was magnificent." The entire dining car fell silent. Mrs. Kingsley turned 3 shades of red and didn't say another word for the rest of the meal. Her husband actually apologized to Mr. Morrison before they left. This is a disaster. Now everyone on the train knows about what happened at the station. Catherine reached across and gently pulled Margaret's hands away from her face. "What everyone knows is that you have a champion. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Most men would have forgotten all about a morning's good deed by dinner time. Mr. Morrison is still defending you hours later." Before Margaret could respond, the man himself appeared in the doorway of their car. His expression was troubled, and he approached their seats with less than his usual confidence. "Miss Whitfield, I owe you an apology." Margaret looked up at him, in confusion. "An apology? For what?" "I'm afraid I may have drawn unwanted attention to you this evening. There was an incident in the dining car, and I handled it poorly." Catherine stood abruptly. "I think I'll go powder my nose and leave you two to talk privately." She disappeared toward the ladies' compartment before either of them could object. Jake sat down across from Margaret, his hat in his hands. "I should have kept my mouth shut. Instead, I may have made things more difficult for you. Mrs. Hartwell told me what happened. You were defending me again, and in doing so, I probably made you the subject of more gossip and speculation. That wasn't my intention." Margaret studied his face in the soft light of the car's oil lamps. "Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you keep doing this? Defending me, I mean. We're strangers. After tomorrow, we'll probably never see each other again. So why do you care what happens to me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before. "My sister Rachel was born with a withered arm. From the time she was a little girl, people stared at her, whispered about her, treated her like she was broken or cursed. She was the smartest, funniest, most courageous person I knew, but the world could never see past that arm. Margaret felt her heart clench. What happened to her? She died when she was 16. Pneumonia. But before she died, she made me promise. Something? Jake's voice caught slightly. She made me promise that if I ever saw someone being treated the way she had been treated, I wouldn't just stand by and watch. She said that staying silent in the face of cruelty was the same as participating in it. So, you're defending me because of a promise you made to your sister? Jake met her eyes directly. I started defending you because of that promise, but I keep defending you because of who you are. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? I mean that in the space of one day, I've watched you handle cruel treatment with dignity, show gratitude without civility, and carry yourself with a quiet strength that most people spend their whole lives trying to develop. You're remarkable, Margaret Whitfield, and anyone who can't see that is blind. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks before she could stop them. You don't know me, Mr. Morrison. You don't know anything about my life or the choices I've made. Then, tell me. The invitation hung in the air between them. Margaret had spent years keeping her story to herself, believing that the details of her life would only confirm what the world already seemed to think about her. But something in Jake's expression, patient, non-judgmental, genuinely interested, made her want to trust him with the truth. I wasn't always alone, she began slowly. 3 years ago, I was engaged to be married to a man named Thomas Brennan. We had known each other since childhood, and everyone in Copper Creek assumed we would marry eventually. Jake nodded encouragingly, but didn't interrupt. Thomas worked at the bank, and he had steady income and good prospects. I thought I was lucky that he wanted to marry me. But as the wedding approached, he became different, critical. He started making comments about my appearance, suggesting that I needed to lose weight before we married. He said it wouldn't look right for a banker's wife to be seen as lacking in self-control. Margaret paused, the memories still painful after 3 years. I tried to accommodate him. I stopped eating meals, wore myself out with exhausting walks, bought a corset so tight I could barely breathe, but it was never enough. 2 weeks before our wedding, he came to my house and told me he couldn't go through with the marriage. He said he had realized he needed a wife who would be an asset to his career, not a liability. Jake's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The whole town knew, of course. The wedding invitations had been sent, the dress was finished, the church was booked. My mother was so humiliated she could barely leave the house. My father was already ill with the consumption that eventually killed him, and the stress of the situation made him worse. I felt like I had brought shame on my entire family. So you left for Denver. I left because I couldn't stand the pitying looks and whispered conversations. Every time I walked down Main Street, I could feel people watching me, wondering what was so wrong with me that Thomas Brennan couldn't bring himself to marry me. I found work with Mrs. Pemberton, the dressmaker, and I've been there ever since. Do you regret leaving? Margaret considered the question. I regret the circumstances that forced me to leave. But I've learned things about myself in Denver that I never would have discovered in Copper Creek. I've learned that I can support myself, that I have skills and talents worth something. I've learned that I don't need someone else's approval to have value. Then why do you seem so convinced that you're not worthy of kindness or respect? The question caught Margaret off guard. I don't think that, don't you? You've apologized for taking up space, for accepting help, for existing in places where other people think you don't belong. You act like you're grateful for scraps of basic human decency instead of expecting to be treated well as a matter of course. Margaret stared at him, recognizing the truth in his words, even as it stung. Thomas Brennan was a fool, Jake continued, but his biggest crime wasn't breaking your engagement. It was convincing you that his opinion of you mattered more than your own. You don't understand. It's not just Thomas. It's everyone. The way people look at me, talk about me, treat me like I'm something to be embarrassed about or ashamed of. Some people, yes, but not everyone. Mrs. Hartwell doesn't look at you that way. I don't look at you that way. Why not? What's different about you? Jake smiled, and there was something almost sad in the expression. Maybe I've learned that the things that make us different from other people are often the things that make us most valuable. My sister taught me that. She could have spent her whole life hiding from the world because of her arm, but instead she lived more fully in 16 years than most people do in 60. Margaret wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. She sounds like an extraordinary person. She would have liked you, I think. She always said she could tell a person's character by how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them in return. And how do I treat people? This afternoon, when the porter spilled coffee on his uniform, you immediately offered to help him clean it up. You didn't just offer to help clean the uniform, you offered to mend the tear that he was worried about. He was so grateful he nearly cried. Margaret flushed. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Margaret. Most people wouldn't have even noticed his distress, let alone offered to help. That's what I mean about your character. The train began to slow as they approached another station. Through the window, Margaret could see the lights of a small town scattered across the prairie like fallen stars. We'll be in Montana tomorrow evening, Jake said quietly. Yes. Back to real life. What will you do after your sister's wedding? Margaret shrugged. Return to Denver, I suppose. Back to Mrs. Pemberton's shop. What if you didn't have to? Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more closely. What do you mean? Jake seemed to be wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he leaned forward, his green eyes intense in the lamplight. Margaret, I know this is going to sound crazy. We've known each other for less than a day, and under normal circumstances, I would never presume to make such a suggestion. But these aren't normal circumstances, and I find myself in the unusual position of knowing exactly what I want for the first time in my adult life. Margaret's heart began to pound. Mr. Morrison, what are you saying? I'm saying that I have 20,000 acres of the most beautiful land in Colorado, a house that's far too big for one person, and a life that would be infinitely better with the right partner to share it. I'm saying that in one day you've shown me qualities that I didn't think existed in another human being. I'm saying that I think we could build something extraordinary together. Margaret stared at him in shock. Are you proposing to me? I'm proposing that you consider it. I know it's sudden, I know it seems impossible. But Margaret, sometimes the most important decisions in life have to be made on faith rather than logic. You don't even know me. I know that you're kind, talented, resilient, and brave. I know that you make me want to be a better man than I was yesterday. I know that when I think about going back to my ranch alone, the idea feels unbearable in a way it never did before. Margaret felt dizzy. This is insane. We're strangers. You're educated, successful. You could have any woman you wanted. Why would you choose someone like me? Jake reached across the space between them and gently took her hands in his. Because you're not just someone, Margaret. You're the someone I've been waiting for without knowing it. You're the woman who can see beauty in wildflowers, who offers help to people who can't help her in return, who faces cruelty with dignity and responds to kindness with grace. You're the woman I want to share my mornings and evenings with, the woman I want to build a life alongside. Margaret felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything tonight. Just promise me you'll think about it. Promise me you'll consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this crazy idea could work. Through the window, the lights of the small town were already disappearing behind them as the train picked up speed. Margaret looked down at their Joined hands, his rough from honest work, hers soft from needle and thread, and tried to imagine a future she had never dared to dream. "I'll think about it," she whispered. Jake smiled, and this time there was nothing sad in the expression. "That's all I can ask for." As the train carried them through the Wyoming night toward an uncertain tomorrow, Margaret held on to Jake Morrison's hands and tried to believe that sometimes miracles really did happen on the Mountain Star Express. Dawn broke over the Montana Territory with the kind of spectacular sunrise that made even seasoned travelers press their faces to train windows. Margaret had barely slept, her mind churning with Jake's proposal and the impossible choice it presented. She had spent the night alternating between dismissing his words as the romantic fancy of a moment and allowing herself to imagine what life on a Colorado ranch might actually be like. The morning brought a new energy to the train as passengers prepared for the final stretch of their journey. Margaret had returned to the standard car early, unable to spend another moment in the luxury that no longer felt like it belonged to her. She found Jake already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and a contemplative expression. "Good morning," she said softly, settling into the seat across from him. "Morning. Did you sleep at all?" "Not much." "You?" Jake shook his head. "Kept thinking about what I said last night, wondering if I'd completely lost my mind." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "And did you? Lose your mind, I mean?" "No. If anything, the morning light has made me more certain. Margaret, I meant every word I said to you." Before she could respond, a commotion near the front of the car drew their attention. Conductor Harvey Brennan was making his way down the aisle, checking tickets and making conversation with passengers. When he reached their row, his expression soured noticeably. Well, our special passenger has decided to join the common folk after all," Harvey said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Jake's jaw tightened, but Margaret placed a restraining hand on his arm before he could speak. "Good morning, Mr. Brennan," she said evenly. "I trust you slept well?" Harvey's eyes narrowed at her polite tone. "I slept fine, thank you. Though I did spend some time thinking about the irregularities in yesterday's boarding process. Very unusual to have passengers switching seats and making special arrangements. Is there a problem with the seating arrangements?" Jake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Oh no problem at all. Just making observations. In 32 years of railroad work, you learn to notice patterns. For instance, I've noticed that certain types of passengers tend to cause disruptions wherever they go." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Mr. Brennan, I've caused no disruptions. I remained quietly in my seat and bothered no one." Yet somehow your presence has generated quite a bit of conversation among the other passengers. People talking about special treatment, unusual accommodations, that sort of thing." Jake started to rise from his seat, but Margaret's grip on his arm tightened. "Mr. Brennan," she said clearly, "I paid for passage on this train just like every other passenger. The arrangements for my seating were made legally and properly. If you have concerns about railroad policy, I suggest you take them up with your supervisors rather than harassing paying customers." Harvey's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the arrival of another passenger, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair and expensive clothes. "Excuse me, conductor," the man said authoritatively. "I couldn't help but overhear this conversation. I'm Judge William Crawford from Denver, and I'm wondering if there's some sort of problem with this passenger's ticket or behavior." Harvey seemed to shrink under the judge's stern gaze. "No, sir, no problem with the ticket. I was just what? Harassing a lady who appears to be conducting herself with perfect propriety?" Judge Crawford's voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "In my experience, problems on trains usually stem from railroad employees who forget that their job is to serve passengers, not to judge them." "Sir, I was only—" You were only creating a disturbance where none existed. I suggest you move along and attend to your actual duties." Harvey mumbled something under his breath and hurried away, leaving Judge Crawford standing in the aisle. "Miss, I apologize for that unpleasant interaction. Some people forget their manners when they think no one important is watching." Margaret looked up at the judge with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. That was very kind of you." "Nonsense. Basic human decency shouldn't be remarkable." Judge Crawford tipped his hat and continued on his way, leaving Margaret and Jake alone again. Jake stared after the departing judge with something like amazement. 3 people in 2 days have stepped forward to defend you. Do you still think the whole world sees you the way that conductor does? Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing what had just happened. I don't know what to think anymore. Maybe that's a good place to start. Not knowing what to think leaves room for new possibilities. The train began to slow as they approached another small station. Through the window, Margaret could see the familiar landscape of her childhood, rolling hills dotted with cattle, wide expanses of grassland, and the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains. "We're getting close to Copper Creek," she said softly, having second thoughts about going home. Margaret considered the question. "I don't know if Copper Creek feels like home anymore. I've been gone so long, and I've changed so much. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going back to a place that doesn't really exist anymore, except in my memory." "What do you mean?" "When I left, I was Thomas Brennan's discarded fiancée, poor Margaret Whitfield who couldn't keep a man. The woman returning is someone different, someone who's lived independently, who's built a career, who's learned her own worth. I'm not sure Copper Creek will know what to do with that person." Jake leaned forward with interest. "And which person do you like better?" "The woman I am now, without question. But I'm not sure she fits in the world I came from." "Maybe she doesn't need to fit. Maybe she needs to create her own world." Margaret met his eyes, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. "Is that what you did when you left Boston for Colorado?" "Exactly. I realized I could spend my life trying to squeeze myself into a shape that pleased other people, or I could go somewhere that had room for who I actually was." "And you think Colorado has room for who I actually am?" Jake's smile was warm and certain. "Margaret, I think Colorado has been waiting for exactly who you are." The train station at Willow Creek appeared around a bend, just 2 stops before Copper Creek. Margaret's stomach began to flutter with nervousness as she realized how close she was to facing her past. "Tell me about your sister," Jake said, seeming to sense her need for distraction. "The one getting married." Margaret's face brightened immediately. "Emma is wonderful. She's 5 years younger than me, and she's everything I'm not. Tiny, beautiful, charming. She can make anyone laugh, and she sees the good in everyone she meets. She sounds lovely. What's her fiancé like?" "David Harper. He owns a small ranch outside town, and he's completely devoted to Emma. They've been courting for 2 years, and you can tell just by looking at them that they're perfect for each other." "You sound happy for her." "I am. Emma deserves all the happiness in the world. She was the only person in Copper Creek who didn't treat me differently after Thomas broke our engagement. She just hugged me and said that any man too stupid to appreciate me wasn't worth crying over." Jake grinned. "I like your sister already." "You'd love her. Everyone does. She has this way of making people feel like they're the most important person in the room." "Is that why you're nervous about seeing her again?" Margaret started to deny being nervous, then stopped. "I suppose I am nervous, not about Emma herself, but about how I'll fit into her happiness. She's starting this wonderful new life with David, and I'm still just me, single, unsuccessful in love, working as a seamstress in a city where no one knows my name. Or you're a woman who's built an independent life, developed valuable skills, and learned to stand on her own 2 feet. Perspective matters, Margaret. When you put it that way, it sounds almost admirable. It is admirable. How many women do you know who could do what you've done? Leave everything familiar, support themselves in a new city, build a reputation for excellent work. Margaret had never thought of her circumstances in quite those terms. I suppose when you put it that, wait, Dutch, I'm not putting it any way except the truth. You're remarkable, Margaret Whitfield, whether you're ready to believe it or not. A new voice interrupted their conversation. Excuse me, are you Miss Margaret Whitfield? They looked up to see a young woman about Emma's age, with brown hair and a friendly smile standing in the aisle. Yes, I am. Oh, wonderful. I'm Sarah Mitchell. Well, Sarah Harper now. I married David's brother last spring. Emma told me to watch for you on the train. Margaret's face lit up with recognition. Sarah, I remember you from school. You married Ben Harper. That's right. Emma asked me to ride out to Willow Creek to meet you, since I was visiting my mother anyway. She thought you might like some company for the last bit of the journey. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. Even after 3 years away, Emma had thought to arrange a friendly face to greet her. That's so thoughtful of her. Sarah, I'd like you to meet Mr. Jake. Morrison! Mr. Morrison, this is Sarah Harper, an old friend from Copper Creek. Sarah glanced between them with obvious curiosity. Mr. Morrison, how nice to meet you. Are you traveling to Copper Creek as well? Jake hesitated for just a moment. Actually, I'm continuing on to Colorado. I was just keeping Miss Whitfield company during the journey. Sarah's eyebrows rose with interest, but she was too polite to pry further. Well, it's lovely that Margaret had such pleasant company. The journey can be so tedious when you're traveling alone. As the train pulled into Willow Creek Station, Sarah gathered her things. Margaret, my buggy is waiting outside. We can collect your luggage and be in Copper Creek within the hour. Margaret looked at Jake, suddenly panicked at the thought of saying goodbye. They had talked about his proposal, but nothing had been decided, nothing settled. In an hour she would be back in her old life, and he would be continuing on to his. Wrench in Colorado. My luggage is in the first-class car, she said, stalling for time. No problem, I'll help you gather everything, Sarah said cheerfully. Jake stood and offered his hand to help Margaret to her feet. It's been an honor. Traveling with you, Miss Whitfield. The formal words stung, but Margaret understood. In front of Sarah, they had to maintain the pretense that they were merely fellow travelers who had shared polite conversation. The honor was mine, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for everything. Their eyes met and held for a moment that stretched, far longer than proprietary dictated. Sarah looked between them with growing understanding. Actually, Sarah said suddenly, Mr. Morrison, if you're not in a terrible hurry to reach Colorado, you should consider stopping in Copper Creek for a day or two. We're having quite a celebration for Emma's wedding. There's going to be dancing, and Mrs. Campbell is making her famous apple pies. The whole town will be celebrating. Jake's eyes never left Margaret's face. That sounds wonderful, but I wouldn't want to impose on a family celebration. Nonsense. Any friend of Margaret's is welcome. Besides, after spending 2 days on the train, you probably need a good meal and a real bed before continuing your journey. Margaret held her breath, afraid to hope. Jake seemed to be wrestling with some internal debate. Well, he said finally, I suppose one night wouldn't hurt if you're certain it wouldn't be an imposition. Sarah clapped her hands together. Wonderful. It's settled then. Margaret, won't Emma be surprised when you arrive with such a distinguished escort? As they gathered Margaret's belongings and prepared to leave the train, she felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to step into empty air with nothing but faith to catch her. In a few hours, she would be home in Copper Creek, but she would no longer be the same woman who had left 3 years ago. And Jake Morrison, the mysterious cowboy who had changed her life in the space of 2 days, would be there beside her as she faced whatever came next. The ride from Willow Creek to Copper Creek passed in a blur of familiar landmarks and nervous conversation. Sarah Harper proved to be an enthusiastic guide, pointing out changes in the landscape and catching Margaret up on 3 years' worth of local news. Jake rode beside them on a horse he had rented at the station, cutting an impressive figure against the Montana sky. Old Mr. Peterson finally sold his general store to the Hendersons, Sarah was saying as their buggy bounced along the dusty road. And you'll never guess, the widow Morrison married Sheriff Dalton last fall, biggest wedding Copper Creek had seen in years. Margaret found herself only half listening to the local gossip. Her attention kept drifting to Jake, who rode with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. Every mile that brought them closer to town made her more aware that soon she would have to choose between the life she had built in Denver and the impossible dream Jake had offered her. "Margaret, did you hear what I said about the Brennans?" Margaret snapped back to attention. "The Brennans!" "Thomas's family. They moved to Billings about 6 months after you left. His father lost quite a bit of money in some bad investments, and they had to sell the house. Thomas went to work for his uncle's bank there." Margaret felt a strange mixture of relief and vindication. The man who had rejected her for being unsuitable as a banker's wife had ended up losing his position and leaving town in disgrace. "I'm sorry to hear they had financial troubles," she said diplomatically. Sarah gave her a knowing look. "Are you, really, after the way he treated you? What happened between Thomas and me was a long time ago. I hope he's found happiness in Billings." "You've become very gracious during your time away," Sarah observed. "The old Margaret would have had some choice words about Thomas Brennan." Margaret glanced at Jake, who was riding close enough to overhear their conversation. "I suppose Denver taught me that carrying grudges is just another kind of burden. I'd rather travel light." As they crested the hill overlooking Copper Creek, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The town looked exactly as she remembered it, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, with the white steeple of the Methodist church rising above the cottonwood trees. Smoke curled from chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business in the distance. "There it is," Sarah said softly. "Home." But was it still home? Margaret studied the familiar scene and felt like a stranger looking at someone else's life. She had changed so much in 3 years that she wondered if she would even recognize the woman who had once walked those streets. Jake guided his horse closer to the buggy. "It's a beautiful town," he said to Margaret. "I can see why you'd want to come back." "I'm not sure I am coming back," Margaret replied quietly. "I think I'm just visiting." As they drove down Main Street, heads began to turn. Margaret recognized many of the faces that peered out from storefronts and doorways, though she noticed that some people seemed to need a second look before recognizing her. She supposed that confidence and 3 years of city living had changed her appearance more than she realized. "Margaret Whitfield, is that really you?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Henry Campbell, the town's unofficial chronicler of everyone's business. She stood on the porch of Campbell's Mercantile, her eyes bright with curiosity, as she took in not only Margaret's return, but also the handsome stranger riding beside her. "Hello, Mrs. Campbell," Margaret called from the buggy. "It's good to see you again. My goodness, you look different, very sophisticated. And who might this gentleman be?" Before Margaret could answer, Sarah jumped in. "This is Mr. Jake Morrison from Colorado. He was kind enough to escort Margaret home from Denver." Mrs. Campbell's eyebrows shot up. "How wonderful! Mr. Morrison, you must stay for the wedding festivities. We don't often get visitors from Colorado." Jake touched the brim of his hat politely. "That's very kind of you, ma'am. I'm looking forward to meeting the bride." "Oh, Emma will be beside herself with excitement when she sees Margaret has arrived with such a distinguished escort. You know, Margaret, your sister has been practically dancing on air all week. She'll be so pleased you made it in time." As they continued through town, Margaret noticed that their procession was drawing considerable attention. People stepped out of shops to wave, and she caught glimpses of conversations, halting mid-sentence as they passed. By the time they reached the boarding house where Margaret would be staying, quite a crowd had gathered. Word travels fast in small towns, Jake observed with amusement. Too fast, Margaret muttered, feeling self-conscious under the scrutiny of so many familiar eyes. The boarding house was run by Mrs. Dorothy Fielding, a kindly widow who had known Margaret's family for years. She emerged from the front door with her arms outstretched before they had even come to a complete stop. "Margaret Rose Whitfield, come here and let me look at you." Margaret found herself enveloped in a warm embrace that smelled of lavender and fresh bread. Mrs. Fielding held her at arm's length, studying her face with the intensity of someone reading a beloved book. "My dear girl, you've grown so elegant. City living agrees with you. And goodness, is this the gentleman Sarah mentioned? Mr. Morrison, welcome to Copper Creek. Any friend of Margaret's is family here." Jake dismounted and removed his hat. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Fielding. I hope I'm not imposing by staying the night." "Imposing? Nonsense. It's been far too long since we've had such distinguished company. I'll put you in the blue room. It has the best view of the mountains." As they gathered their belongings, Margaret noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the street. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized Dr. Marcus Hendricks, the town's young physician and the man who had once shown interest in courting her before Thomas claimed her attention. Marcus had always been handsome in a quiet, intellectual way, but 3 years had added a maturity to his features that made him even more attractive. He approached with the confident stride of a man who had found his place in the world. "Margaret," he said warmly, taking her hands in greeting. "Welcome home. You look wonderful." "Marcus, it's so good to see you. You look well yourself." "I heard. You were coming back for Emma's wedding. The whole town's been talking about it." His eyes moved to Jake with polite curiosity. "I don't believe we've met." "Dr. Hendricks, this is Mr. Jake Morrison from Colorado," Margaret said, aware that everyone within earshot was hanging on every word. "Mr. Morrison, Dr. Hendricks is Copper Creek's physician." The two men shook hands, and Margaret noticed Jake's grip was perhaps a bit firmer than strictly necessary. "Doctor," Jake said cordially, "it's a pleasure to meet you." "Likewise." "What brings you to our little town, Mr. Morrison?" "I had the good fortune to meet Miss Whitfield on the train from Denver. When I heard about the wedding celebration, I decided to extend my journey." Marcus's expression remained pleasant, but Margaret caught a flicker of something, disappointment, competition, in his eyes. "How fortunate for all of us, I'm sure. Margaret appreciates having such attentive company for the journey." "Mr. Morrison was very kind," Margaret said carefully, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. Mrs. Fielding clapped her hands together. "Well, this is all very exciting, but we should get you both settled before Emma arrives. She's due any minute. She's been checking the road every hour since dawn." As if summoned by her words, the sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Emma herself. Margaret turned to see her sister dismounting from a spirited chestnut mare with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. Emma Whitfield was indeed everything Margaret had described. Petite, golden-haired, and possessed of an inner light that seemed to make everything around her brighter. She was dressed in a simple blue riding habit, but she moved with such natural elegance that she might have been wearing a ball gown. "Margaret!" Emma flew across the space between them and threw herself into her sister's arms with such enthusiasm that they both nearly toppled over. "You're here! You're actually here! I was so afraid something would happen and you wouldn't make it." Margaret held her sister tight, feeling tears spring to her eyes. "I wouldn't have missed your wedding for anything in the world, Em." Emma pulled back to study her sister's face, her hands still gripping Margaret's arms. "You look so polished, so confident. Denver has been good to you." "It's been educational," Margaret said with a smile. Emma's attention suddenly shifted to Jake, who had been standing quietly nearby, watching the reunion with obvious pleasure. "And who is this handsome gentleman? Margaret, you didn't tell me you were bringing a suitor to my wedding." Margaret felt her face flame red. "Emma, Mr. Morrison is not... We're not... He's just a fellow passenger who was kind enough to help me with my journey." Emma's eyes sparkled with mischief as she looked between Margaret and Jake. "Just a fellow passenger, Margaret Rose Whitfield, you never could lie to me. This man has been staring at you like you hung the moon and stars." "Emma, please." But Jake stepped forward with that easy confidence Margaret had come to admire. "Miss Emma, I'm Jake Morrison. Your sister is far too modest about the circumstances of our meeting, but I can say with complete honesty that traveling with her has been the greatest pleasure of my journey." Emma practically glowed with delight. "Oh, I like him already. Margaret, he's charming, and look at those shoulders." "Emma, what?" "I'm getting married tomorrow, not going blind. Mr. Morrison, you simply must stay for the wedding. David has several friends coming from surrounding ranches, and we could use another handsome man to balance out the party." Jake glanced at Margaret. Before answering, "If it wouldn't be an imposition, I'd be honored to attend." "Wonderful. Oh, Margaret, this is perfect. You've come home with a mysterious cowboy just in time for my wedding. It's like something out of a novel." Dr. Hendricks, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, cleared his throat. "Emma, perhaps we should let Margaret get settled before we start planning her romantic future." Emma looked at Marcus with surprise, as if just noticing his presence. "Oh, Marcus, how nice to see you. I didn't realize you were here." "I came to welcome Margaret home," Marcus said, his tone carefully neutral. "How thoughtful of you." "Margaret, you remember Marcus, don't you? He's been asking about you ever since you left. In fact, he's been quite the eligible bachelor around here, but he never seems interested in any of the local ladies. I wonder why that is." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken implications. Margaret found herself caught between three pairs of male eyes. Jake's intense and possessive, Marcus's hopeful and determined, and half the town watching from a respectful distance. "Well," Mrs. Fielding said briskly, breaking the tension, "I think it's time we got everyone inside and properly settled. Margaret, your room is ready, and Mr. Morrison, I'll show you to yours. Emma, dear, your mother sent word that she needs you home to help with the final preparations." As the group began to disperse, Jake caught Margaret's arm gently. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Margaret looked around at the familiar faces, the unchanged streets, the life she had once thought she wanted to return to. "I think so. It's just strange being back. Everything looks the same, but it all feels different. Maybe it's not the town that's changed." "No, I think you're right about that." Emma appeared at Margaret's other side, having apparently dismissed her horse to the care of a young boy who had appeared to tend to it. "Margaret, before you disappear inside, you have to tell me everything. And I mean everything. How did you meet Mr. Morrison? Is he courting you? Are you in love? Because I have to say, the way he looks at you suggests some very interesting possibilities." Margaret glanced toward Jake, who was being shown into the boarding house by Mrs. Fielding. It's complicated. The best love stories always are. Come on, let's go inside. And you can tell me all about your mysterious cowboy while I help you unpack. This is going to be the most exciting wedding week Copper Creek has ever seen." As Emma linked arms with her and pulled her toward the boarding house, Margaret caught one last glimpse of Dr. Hendricks standing alone in the street, watching them go with an expression of determined resignation. She had been home for less than an hour, and already her carefully ordered world was spinning into chaos. Tomorrow was Emma's wedding. Jake's proposal still hung unanswered between them, and she was beginning to suspect that her hometown held more complications than she had anticipated. But for the first time in 3 years, Margaret Whitfield felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, even if she had no idea what would happen next. Margaret's childhood bedroom at the boarding house felt smaller than she remembered, though Mrs. Fielding had decorated it with fresh wildflowers and her grandmother's quilt. Emma sat cross-legged on the narrow bed, watching with barely contained excitement as Margaret unpacked her traveling case. "That dress is absolutely stunning," Emma said, fingering the fabric of a deep emerald gown Margaret had made for special occasions. "The stitching is so fine it looks like machine work, but I can tell it's done by hand. You've become quite the seamstress." "Mrs. Pemberton is an excellent teacher. She caters to Denver's wealthiest ladies, so I've learned to work with expensive fabrics and complex designs." Emma held up the dress admiringly. "This is finer than anything in Morrison's dress shop here in town. You could start your own business with skills like these." Margaret paused in her unpacking. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that she might retire next year and would consider selling the shop to the right person." "Margaret, that's wonderful. Your own business in Denver." "It would require a significant investment, though. More money than I have saved." Emma's expression grew thoughtful. "What about a partner? Someone with capital who believes in your talents?" Before Margaret could respond, a gentle knock on the door interrupted them. "Come in," Emma called. Jake appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I apologize for the intrusion, ladies. Mrs. Fielding asked me to let you know that dinner will be served in an hour." "Perfect timing." Emma sprang up from the bed. "Mr. Morrison, please come in. I was just admiring my sister's handiwork. Look at this dress. Have you ever seen such beautiful stitching?" Jake stepped into the room, his eyes moving from the dress to Margaret. "It's exquisite, like everything Miss Whitfield creates." Emma's eyebrows rose at the intimate tone in his voice. "You've seen other examples of Margaret's work?" "She was wearing one of her own designs when we met. I noticed the quality immediately. My mother was a seamstress, so I learned to appreciate fine workmanship early." "How interesting. Margaret, did you know Mr. Morrison had such an eye for ladies' fashion?" Margaret shot her sister a warning look. "Emma, I'm sure Mr. Morrison has better things to do than discuss dressmaking." "On the contrary," Jake said, settling into the room's single chair. "I find it fascinating. It takes real artistry to create something both beautiful and functional. Not unlike designing a ranch, actually. You have to consider both form and function, beauty and practicality." Emma clapped her hands together. "Oh, that's a lovely comparison. See, Margaret, artists understand each other, regardless of their medium." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm hardly an artist, Em. I'm a seamstress who's learned to copy other people's designs." "That's not true," Jake said firmly. "The dress you wore on the train was entirely your own design. I could tell because it was perfectly suited to you. Your coloring, your figure, your personality. No copied pattern could have achieved that." Emma practically bounced with excitement. "You see? Mr. Morrison recognizes real talent when he sees it." "To Margaret, you're being far too modest." A commotion in the hallway outside interrupted their conversation. Through the open door, they could hear Mrs. Fielding's voice, raised in agitation. "Dr. Hendricks, I really don't think this is appropriate. Miss Whitfield has only just arrived, and she has company. Mrs. Fielding, I simply want to welcome her home properly. Surely there's nothing inappropriate about that." Jake's expression darkened as he recognized the voice. Emma, meanwhile, looked impositively delighted by this new development. "Oh my," she whispered, "poor Marcus. He's been carrying a torch for Margaret ever since she left. I think he always regretted not speaking up before Thomas claimed her attention." Margaret felt trapped between mortification and panic. "Emma, you can't be serious." as serious as a summer storm. Marcus has asked about you in every letter I've written to you over the past 3 years. I may have encouraged his hopes a bit. You what? Before Emma could explain further, Dr. Hendricks appeared in the doorway, looking determined despite Mrs. Fielding's obvious disapproval hovering behind him. Margaret, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I brought you something. He held out a small bouquet of roses from his own garden. I remember these were always your favorites. Margaret accepted the flowers with a gracious smile, though she was acutely aware of Jake's rigid posture in his chair. Thank you, Marcus. They're lovely. I was hoping you might join me for a walk around town before dinner. Catch up on old times, see what's changed since you've been away. Emma bounced slightly on her toes. What a wonderful idea. Margaret loves walks, don't you, sister? Margaret shot Emma another warning look before turning to Marcus. That's very thoughtful, but I'm rather tired from the journey, and I need to finish unpacking. Perhaps tomorrow then, after the wedding festivities die down a bit? Jake stood abruptly, his movement sharp enough to draw everyone's attention. Actually, Miss Whitfield and I had discussed taking a ride tomorrow to see the countryside. She mentioned wanting to show me the local landmarks. Margaret stared at him in surprise. They had discussed no such thing. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. I see. Well, perhaps the day after, then. The tension in the small room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma looked back and forth between the two men with barely concealed glee, while Margaret wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Gentlemen, she said finally, you're both very kind, but I think I should focus on spending time with my family while I'm here. After all, I'll only be in town for a few days. Both men's expressions shifted at this reminder. Marcus looked disappointed, while Jake's face became carefully neutral. Of course, Marcus said graciously, family comes first. I hope you'll at least save me a dance at the wedding reception tomorrow. I'd be honored, Margaret replied. Marcus nodded to Jake with professional courtesy. Mr. Morrison, I hope you enjoy your stay in Copper Creek. If you need anything during your visit, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you, Doctor. That's very generous. After Marcus left, an awkward silence settled over the room. Emma finally broke it with characteristic directness. Well, that was certainly interesting. Margaret, you seem to have quite an effect on the local male population. Margaret sank onto the bed with a groan. This is exactly what I was afraid of. I don't want to hurt Marcus, but I don't want to encourage him either. And what about Mr. Morrison? Emma asked, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Do you want to encourage him? Jake cleared his throat. Perhaps I should leave you ladies to finish your preparations for dinner. Nonsense, Emma said quickly. You're part of this conversation whether you like it or not. Anyone with eyes can see that something significant has happened between you and my sister. The question is, what are you planning to do about it? Emma, Margaret protested. What? Someone needs to ask the direct questions around here. You two have been dancing around each other like nervous schoolchildren at their first social. Jake looked at Margaret, something unreadable in his expression. Your sister has a point. We do need to talk about what happens next. What do you mean, what happens next? Emma demanded. Are you courting my sister or not? The blunt question hung in the air. Margaret felt her heart pounding as she waited for Jake's response. Emma, Margaret said quietly, Mr. Morrison has made me a proposition, but it's complicated. What kind of proposition? Emma's eyes grew wide. Are we talking about marriage? Jake met Margaret's gaze directly. Yes, we are. Emma let out a small shriek of excitement. Margaret Rose Whitfield, you've been home for 2 hours and you haven't told me you have a marriage proposal from a handsome rancher. Are you completely out of your mind? It's not that simple, Em. We've only known each other for 2 days. So, Mother knew Father for exactly 3 days before he proposed, and they were married for 28 years before the fever took him. Margaret shook her head. That was different. They met at a church social where everyone knew everyone else's families. Jake and I are complete strangers who happened to meet on a train." "Are you?" Jake asked quietly. "Complete strangers, I mean." Margaret looked at him, remembering their conversations during the journey, the way he had defended her, the easy comfort she felt in his presence. "And, I don't know," Emma clapped her hands together. "This is the most romantic thing I've ever heard. Margaret, you have to say yes. You absolutely have to." "Emma, you don't understand. Jake's ranch is in Colorado territory. If I married him, I'd have to leave everything, my job, my life in Denver, any chance of buying Mrs. Pemberton's shop. Or you'd be gaining everything, a husband who adores you, a beautiful ranch, a completely new adventure. Margaret, when has playing it safe ever made you happy?" Jake stood and moved to the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. "Margaret, your sister's right about one thing. Playing it safe isn't always the answer, but she's also right that this decision shouldn't be rushed. You should take all the time you need to think about it." "How much time do I have?" Margaret asked softly. "I'm planning to leave for Colorado the day after tomorrow. My foreman is expecting me back, and I've already been away longer than planned." Emma's face fell. "The day after tomorrow, but that's barely any time at all." "It's enough time," Jake said, still looking out the window. "Either Margaret knows in her heart what she wants or she doesn't. I won't pressure her into a decision that could change both our lives." Margaret studied his profile, noting the tension in his shoulders and the careful control in his voice. Despite his calm words, she could tell that her answer mattered to him more than he was letting on. "Jake," she said softly. He turned back to face her, and she saw something vulnerable in his green eyes that made her chest tighten. "I need you to know that it's not about you. If I say no, it's not because I don't, because you're not. It's just that I've worked so hard to build an independent life. The idea of giving that up, even for something wonderful, terrifies me." Jake's expression softened. "I know. And I want you to know that I'm not asking you to give up who you are. I'm asking you to become who you could be, with the right partner beside you." Emma wiped tears from her eyes. "Oh, you two are going to make me cry, and I haven't even finished with the wedding preparations yet." A bell chimed from downstairs, signaling that dinner was ready. "We should go down," Margaret said, standing and smoothing her skirts. "Mrs. Fielding doesn't like to be kept waiting." As they prepared to leave the room, Emma caught Margaret's arm. "Sister, I know I tease you, but I want you to know, whatever you decide, I support you. You've already shown more courage than most people manage in a lifetime. Trust yourself to know what's right." Margaret squeezed her sister's hand. "Thank you, Em. That means everything to me." As they walked downstairs to join the other guests for dinner, Margaret felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. Tomorrow was Emma's wedding day, and the day after that, Jake Morrison would leave for Colorado territory. Time was running out, and she still had no idea what her heart was trying to tell her. Emma's wedding day dawned with the kind of perfect Montana morning that made poets write sonnets and artists abandon their studios to paint outdoors. The sky stretched endlessly blue above the rolling hills, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of prairie grass and wild roses through the open windows of the boarding house. Margaret woke before sunrise, unable to sleep through the mixture of excitement for her sister and anxiety about her own future. She dressed quietly in a simple grey dress and slipped out of the boarding house to walk through the empty streets of Copper Creek, hoping to clear her mind before the festivities began. Town looked different in the early morning light, softer somehow, more like the home of her memories. She found herself drawn to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley, where her father rested beneath a simple stone marker. Margaret knelt beside the grave and traced the familiar letters of his name with her finger. "Hello, Papa," she whispered. "I wish you were here to walk Emma down the aisle today. She's grown into such a beautiful woman. You'd be so proud of her." The morning breeze rustled through the cottonwood trees, and Margaret could almost imagine her father's voice in the sound. He had always been a practical man, slow to speak but wise in his counsel. What would he tell her about Jake's proposal? "Miss Whitfield?" Margaret turned to find Jake approaching across the cemetery, his hat in his hands and concern written across his features. "I saw you leaving the boarding house and thought you might need some company," he said softly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. I couldn't sleep and I wanted to visit my father before the wedding." Jake stopped a respectful distance away. "Would you like me to leave you alone with him?" Margaret shook her head. "No, please stay. I think he would have liked you." Jake moved closer, reading the inscription on the gravestone. "Jonathan Whitfield, beloved husband and father. He died young. Consumption. It took him slowly, over 2 years. Emma was barely 16 when we lost him." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "He made me promise to take care of her, to make sure she had chances he couldn't give her. I think that's part of why I stayed away so long. I needed to prove I could support myself so I'd never be a burden to her. And you have proved it. You've built a life entirely on your own terms." Margaret stood and brushed dirt from her skirts. "Sometimes I wonder if I've been hiding behind that independence, using it as an excuse to avoid taking risks that might lead to real happiness." "What kind of risks?" "The risk of trusting someone else with my heart. The risk of believing that someone could love me exactly as I am, without trying to change me into someone more acceptable." Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his green eyes. "Margaret, I fell in love with exactly who you are. I'm not interested in changing a single thing about you." The word love hung between them like a bridge. Margaret wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. "You can't know that," she said softly. "You've known me for 3 days. I know that you're kind without being weak, strong without being hard, and beautiful without being vain. I know that you see the best in people even when they don't see it in themselves. I know that you have the courage to stand up for what's right even when it costs you something. What else do I need to know?" Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "You need to know that I'm terrified. I've spent 3 years learning to depend only on myself, and the idea of trusting my happiness to someone else feels like stepping off a cliff. What if I stepped off with you?" Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. They turned to see Dr. Hendricks riding up the hill toward the cemetery, followed by David Harper, Emma's groom-to-be. David Harper was exactly what Margaret had expected from Emma's descriptions: tall, sandy-haired, and possessed of the kind of steady reliability that made him perfect for her spirited sister. He dismounted and approached them with a warm smile. "Miss Margaret, I'm so glad to finally meet you. Emma talks about you constantly. I feel like I know you already." Margaret found herself immediately liking this man, who would soon be her brother-in-law. "David, the pleasure is mine. Emma is lucky to have found someone who makes her so happy." "I'm the lucky one, believe me." David's expression grew slightly nervous. "Actually, I was hoping I might have a word with you before the ceremony. There's something I wanted to ask you." Dr. Hendricks had remained mounted, but now he spoke up. "Margaret, I saw you walking this direction and thought you might like an escort back to town. Good morning, Mr. Morrison." Jake nodded politely. "Doctor." Margaret sensed another potential confrontation brewing and quickly intervened. "David, what did you want to ask me?" David glanced uncertainly at the 2 other men. "Well, it's rather personal. Please, speak freely. These are friends." David took a deep breath. "Emma and I have been talking about the future, and we're hoping to start a family soon. But Emma worries about being so far from her sister, especially with you living in Denver. I was wondering, have you ever considered moving back to Montana, permanently, I mean?" Margaret felt Jake's attention sharpen beside her. I hadn't really thought about it. My work is in Denver." Emma mentioned that you're an accomplished seamstress. "There's definitely a need for someone with your skills here in Montana Territory. Copper Creek is growing, and the ranchers' wives are always complaining about having to send to Denver or Salt Lake City for decent dresses. Dr. Hendricks leaned forward in his saddle. David's right. I've heard the same complaints from many of my patients' wives. A skilled dressmaker could do very well here. Margaret looked between the three men, each representing a different path her life could take. David offered family and the comfort of home. Marcus offered familiar affection and a respected place in the community. And Jake offered adventure, love, and a future she couldn't even fully imagine. That's a lot to consider, she said finally. Of course, David said quickly. I didn't mean to pressure you. It's just that Emma misses you terribly, and after losing your father, well, family becomes even more precious. The sound of church bells chiming in the distance reminded them all that the wedding was only hours away. We should head back, Dr. Hendricks said. Emma will be looking for her sister, and the bride shouldn't have to worry about where her maid of honor has gotten to. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Margaret took one last look at her father's grave. In her heart, she felt as if she was asking his permission for whatever decision she was about to make. The ride back to town passed in companionable conversation about the wedding preparations and the guests who had arrived from neighboring ranches. Margaret learned that nearly the entire county had turned out for the celebration, making it one of the largest gatherings Copper Creek had seen in years. Back at the boarding house, Mrs. Fielding met them at the door with barely contained panic. Margaret, thank goodness you're back. Emma is in a complete state. She can't find something borrowed, her hair won't cooperate, and she's convinced that David is going to change his mind and ride off into the sunset. Margaret laughed. That sounds like Emma on any ordinary day, let alone her wedding day. Where is she? In her room at the Harper house. Sarah sent word asking if you could come immediately. Margaret gathered her skirts and prepared to rush to her sister's aid, but Jake caught her arm gently. Margaret, before you go, I want you to know that whatever you decide about us, watching you with your family has been a privilege. Emma is lucky to have a sister like you. Their eyes met and held for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Then Margaret hurried away, leaving Jake standing in the morning sunlight with an expression of hope and determination. At the Harper house, Margaret found Emma pacing her temporary room like a caged wildcat, her wedding dress laid out on the bed and her hair half-pinned in a style that had clearly been attempted and abandoned multiple times. Margaret, finally! I'm a complete disaster. Look at me, I look like I've been dragged through a bramble bush backwards. Margaret took one look at her sister and burst into laughter. Emma's hair was indeed a catastrophe of half-curled tendrils and bobby pins, but her eyes were bright with excitement and her cheeks glowed with happiness. You looked like a bride having pre-wedding nerves, which is perfectly normal. Now sit down and let me fix your hair properly. For the next hour, Margaret worked her magic with brush and pins, transforming Emma's chaotic curls into an elegant, upswept style adorned with tiny white roses from the Harper garden. As she worked, Emma chattered nervous about everything and nothing. Do you think David really wants to marry me? What if he realizes I talk too much? What if I trip walking down the aisle? What if Emma Rose Harper, Margaret said firmly, using the married name her sister would bear in a few hours. David Harper has been completely smitten with you since the day you met. He lights up like a Christmas tree whenever you walk into a room. The man is not going to change his mind. Emma met her sister's eyes in the mirror. Were you this nervous before your wedding to Thomas? Margaret paused in her pinning. I wasn't nervous at all, actually. I think I should have been. What do you mean? I mean that marrying Thomas felt like the logical next step, not like a leap of faith. I was more worried about the wedding dress fitting properly than about whether I was making the right choice. Emma turned in her chair to face her sister directly. And how do you feel about Mr. Morrison's proposal? Nervous or logical? Margaret sank onto the bed beside Emma's wedding dress, absolutely terrified, which probably means it's the right choice. Emma's face lit up with joy. Margaret, are you saying yes? Are you going to marry him? I think I am. I think I've been trying to talk myself out of it because I'm scared, but the truth is, I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about Jake Morrison. Emma threw her arms around her sister, careful not to disturb her newly perfect hair. Oh, Margaret, I'm so happy for you. This is going to be the most wonderful wedding day ever, your engagement and my marriage all in one celebration. Emma, I haven't said yes yet. And even if I do, we'd have to plan everything. He's leaving for Colorado tomorrow. So go with him. You can have a simple ceremony this afternoon, right after mine. Pastor Williams could marry you both. I'm sure he wouldn't mind. It would be like a double wedding. Margaret stared at her sister in shock. Emma, I can't get married this afternoon. That's completely insane. Why not? You love him, don't you? Margaret thought about Jake's proposal, about the way he had defended her on the train, about the ranch he had described with such passion. Yes, she said softly, I think I do love him. Then what are you waiting for? Margaret, you've spent 3 years being careful and practical. Maybe it's time to be brave and impractical instead. Through the window, Margaret could see guests beginning to gather outside the church. In a few hours, Emma would walk down that aisle to begin her new life with David Harper. And tomorrow, Jake Morrison would leave for Colorado territory. Margaret looked at her sister's radiant face and made a decision that would change everything. Emma, do you really think Pastor Williams would perform a second ceremony today? Emma's squeal of delight could probably be heard all the way to the church. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of Copper Creek Methodist Church as Emma glided down the aisle in her grandmother's silk wedding dress, her face radiant with joy. Margaret stood at the altar as maid of honor, watching her sister marry the love of her life, all while her own heart hammered with the secret decision she had made. Pastor Williams pronounced David and Emma husband and wife to thunderous applause from the packed church. As the newlyweds kissed, Margaret caught Jake's eye across the congregation. He sat in the back row, looking devastatingly handsome in his dark suit, and when their gazes met, she saw a question there that made her pulse quicken. After the ceremony, as guests began moving toward the church hall for the reception, Margaret approached Pastor Williams with trembling hands. Pastor, might I have a word with you privately? It's rather urgent. The elderly minister studied her face with the wisdom of someone who had officiated at dozens of weddings. Of course, my dear. Is everything all right? Margaret glanced around the emptying church and spotted Jake still seated in his pew, as if waiting for some signal from her. Pastor Williams, would it be possible for you to perform another ceremony today? A very simple one? The pastor's eyebrows rose with interest. Another wedding? Today? Yes, sir. Between myself and Mr. Morrison, the gentleman sitting in the back pew. Pastor Williams looked over at Jake, who had noticed their conversation and was now walking toward them with measured steps. Miss Whitfield, this is quite sudden. Have you given this decision proper consideration? I've given it all the consideration. My heart can stand, Margaret replied honestly. I know it seems impulsive, but sometimes the most important decisions feel that way. Jake reached them, his expression carefully controlled. Pastor Williams, I'm Jake Morrison. Margaret, is everything all right? Margaret turned to face him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Of course. When you proposed to me on the train, were you asking me to marry you because you felt sorry for me, because you wanted to rescue me from my circumstances? Jake's expression shifted to something fierce and tender. Margaret Rose Whitfield, I asked you to marry me because I fell in love with the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met. I asked you because I can't imagine building a life with anyone else. I asked you because you make me want to be the man you deserve. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. In that case, my answer is yes. The change in Jake's expression was like watching the sun rise. Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Today, if Pastor Williams is willing. I don't want to wait another moment to start our life together. Jake swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the empty church, while Pastor Williams chuckled at their exuberance. Well then, the pastor said warmly, I suppose we have another wedding to perform. But first, shouldn't we tell the bride and groom? And perhaps find you some witnesses. An hour later, Margaret stood in the church vestry wearing Emma's second-best dress, hastily altered to fit her figure. Emma had insisted on lending her the pearl necklace that had been their mother's, and Sarah Harper had woven wildflowers into Margaret's hair. I can't believe we're doing this, Margaret said, staring at her reflection in the small mirror. I can't believe it took you this long to say yes, Emma replied, adjusting the flowers one final time. Margaret, you're absolutely glowing. I've never seen you look so beautiful. Through the vestry door, they could hear the guests reassembling in the church. Word of the surprise second wedding had spread quickly through the reception, and the entire town seemed determined to witness this unexpected turn of events. Dr. Hendricks had taken the news with gracious disappointment, shaking Jake's hand and wishing them both happiness. David Harper had clapped Jake on the back and declared that any man brave enough to marry a Whitfield sister was welcome in the family. Are you ready? Emma asked softly. Margaret took a deep breath, thinking of the train journey that had brought her to this moment, of Jake's steady presence and unwavering belief in her worth. I'm ready. The church doors opened, and Margaret walked down the aisle toward her future. Jake stood at the altar, looking like he couldn't quite believe his good fortune, his eyes never leaving her face as she approached. Pastor Williams kept the ceremony simple but heartfelt. When he asked Jake to recite his vows, the rancher's voice rang clear and strong through the church. Margaret, I promise to love you exactly as you are, to support your dreams as well as share mine, and to spend every day proving that you made the right choice in trusting me with your heart. Margaret's own vows came from the deepest part of her soul. Jake, I promise to be brave enough to build this life with you, to trust in our love, even when it scares me, and to never forget that the best decisions are often the ones that feel impossible until you make them. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss was gentle and reverent, full of promise for the life they would build together. The reception that followed was unlike anything Copper Creek had ever seen. 2 wedding cakes, 2 sets of toasts, and twice the celebration as the town embraced both couples with overwhelming joy. As evening fell and the festivities began to wind down, Margaret found herself on the church steps with Jake, watching the last of the guests disperse into the Montana twilight. Mrs. Morrison, Jake said softly, testing out her new name. I like the sound of that, Margaret replied, leaning into his warmth. So what happens now? Do you need time to collect your things from Denver? Margaret shook her head. I sent a telegram to Mrs. Pemberton from the church office. I explained the situation and asked her to ship my belongings to Colorado. As for the dress shop, she smiled up at her new husband. I think I'd rather start fresh, maybe design a new kind of life entirely. Jake's arms tightened around her. Are you sure? You've worked so hard to build your independence. I'm not giving up my independence, Jake. I'm choosing to share it with someone who values it as much as I do. From inside the church, they could hear Emma's laughter mixing with David's deeper chuckle, and Margaret felt a deep contentment settle over her. Do you think we're crazy? She asked. Getting married after knowing each other for 3 days? Jake considered the question seriously. Maybe, but sometimes being crazy is exactly what a person needs to find their way to happiness. As they prepared to leave for their new life in Colorado territory, Margaret thought about the woman who had boarded the train in Denver just days ago, afraid, alone, and convinced that she was destined for a life of quiet invisibility. That woman would Never have believed that a chance encounter with a kind stranger could transform everything. She would never have imagined standing on church steps as a bride, surrounded by a community that had embraced her courage and celebrated her happiness. But sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest acts of human kindness, a stranger defending your dignity, a hand offered in friendship, a heart brave enough to believe in love at first sight. The next morning brought a flurry of preparations as the newlyweds prepared for their journey to Colorado Territory. Jake had arranged for additional supplies and a sturdy wagon that could handle the rough mountain roads ahead. Margaret packed her few belongings alongside wedding gifts from the townspeople, preserves from Mrs. Campbell, a hand-carved wooden box from the blacksmith, and a beautiful quilt sewn by the ladies of the Methodist Church. Emma helped her sister prepare for the journey, her eyes bright with tears. She was trying valiantly not to shed. "I'm going to miss you terribly," Emma said, folding Margaret's traveling dress with unnecessary care. "But I've never seen you so happy. It's like you've been lit from within." "I feel different," Margaret admitted. "Like I've been holding my breath for years and can finally exhale. Promise me you'll write every week. I want to hear about everything. The ranch, Colorado Territory, your new life, everything." Margaret hugged her sister tightly. "I promise. And you and David must come visit us once we're settled. Jake says the ranch has plenty of room for guests." Dr. Hendricks arrived just as they were loading the last of their supplies. He approached with professional dignity, though Margaret could see the effort it cost him. "Mrs. Morrison," he said formally, "I wanted to wish you safe travels and every happiness in your new life." "Thank you, Marcus. That means a great deal. To me." He handed her a small leather journal bound with a blue ribbon. "I thought you might like to record your journey. New beginnings deserve to be remembered." Margaret accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. "This is beautiful. I'll treasure it." Marcus turned to Jake with the careful respect of a man acknowledging a worthy rival. "Take good care of her, Morrison. She's one of the finest women I've ever known." Jake shook his hand firmly. "I intend to spend every day proving I'm worthy of her trust." As they prepared to depart, more townspeople gathered to see them off. Mrs. Fielding pressed a basket of food into Margaret's hands, tears streaming down her face. Judge Crawford, who had happened to be staying over in town, approached with a legal document. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband mentioned you're a talented seamstress. I took the liberty of drawing up incorporation papers for a dressmaking business should you decide to establish one in Colorado. Consider it a wedding gift from one entrepreneur to another." Margaret stared at the papers in amazement. "Judge Crawford, this is incredibly generous." "Nonsense. Talent should be cultivated. And from what I observed on the train, you have considerable talent indeed." Sarah Harper presented them with a detailed map of the best routes through the Rockies, marked with the locations of reliable way stations and sources of fresh water. "Ben and I traveled this route when we first moved here. These markings will save you time and trouble." Even Mrs. Campbell approached with a gift, a small bag of her special tea blend. "For when you're feeling homesick," she said gruffly, "though something tells me you won't be homesick for long." As Jake checked the wagon traces one final time, Margaret climbed up to the driver's bench and looked out over the assembled crowd. These people had known her as a girl, watched her grow up, witnessed her humiliation with Thomas, and now they were celebrating her courage to start anew. "Thank you," she called out, her voice carrying across the morning air. "Thank you for everything, for the kindness, the support, and for showing me that home isn't just a place, it's the people who believe in you." Emma stepped forward, radiant, in her new role as Mrs. Harper. "Sister, I have one more gift for you." She handed Margaret a small wrapped package. "Don't open it until you reach the ranch." Jake climbed up beside Margaret and took the reins. "Ready, Mrs. Morrison?" Margaret looked one last time at the faces of her family and friends, memorizing this moment of love and support. "I'm ready." The wagon rolled forward through the dusty streets of Copper Creek, past the general store where she had shopped as a child. past the schoolhouse where she had learned to read, past the church where she had just pledged her life to an extraordinary man. As they reached the edge of town, Margaret turned back to wave at the group that had followed them to the outskirts. Emma stood with David's arm around her waist, and Margaret could see her sister's lips moving in what she knew was a prayer for safe travels. The first day of their journey took them through familiar Montana countryside, rolling hills dotted with cattle and the occasional homestead. Jake proved to be an excellent companion, pointing out wildlife and sharing stories of his own travels through the region. "See that ridgeline?" he said, gesturing toward a distant mountain peak. "That's where Colorado Territory begins. By tomorrow evening, we'll be on my land." Margaret felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with nervousness. "Tell me more about the ranch hands you mentioned. Will they accept a boss's wife showing up so suddenly?" Jake grinned. "Honestly, they'll probably be so relieved that I finally found someone willing to marry me that they'll throw a celebration. I haven't been the easiest person to live with these past few years. Too focused on work, not enough on building a real home. And now I have a partner to build that home with. Everything changes when you have someone to share the sunsets with." That evening, they made camp beside a crystal-clear stream, the water rushing down from snow-capped peaks that glowed pink in the dying light. Jake built a fire while Margaret unpacked their supper, marveling at the domestic simplicity of the task. "I keep expecting to wake up and find this has all been a dream," she said, as they sat beside the fire, sharing bread and cheese under a canopy of stars. "If it is a dream, I never want to wake up." Jake reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Margaret, I need you to know something. What we're doing, this leap of faith we've taken, it's not just romantic foolishness. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Margaret studied his face in the firelight, seeing the sincerity there, the depth of feeling he wasn't trying to hide. "I believe you. And I need you to know that I'm not running away from my old life because I was unhappy. I'm running toward this new life because it feels like coming home to myself." They talked long into the night, sharing childhood memories, dreams for the future, and the comfortable silence of two people discovering they truly understand each other. The second day brought them into Colorado Territory, and Margaret gasped at the dramatic change in landscape. The mountains rose around them like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in clouds, while valleys stretched out below, carpeted with wildflowers. "It's breathtaking," she whispered. "Wait until you see the ranch," Jake promised. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western peaks, they crested a hill, and Margaret saw her new home spread out before them. The Morrison Ranch, nestled in a valley so beautiful it seemed carved by angels, with a stream winding through emerald pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. The ranch house itself was larger than she had expected, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. "Jake, it's magnificent. It will be, with the right woman making it a home." As their wagon approached the house, men emerged from the barn and bunkhouse, the ranch hands Jake had told her about. Margaret straightened her shoulders, preparing to meet her new neighbors. The foreman, a weathered man named Pete Rodriguez, approached with obvious curiosity. "Boss, you weren't expected back for another week." Jake helped Margaret down from the wagon with careful gallantry. "Pete, I'd like you to meet my wife, Margaret Morrison." The silence that followed was broken by Pete's whoop of delight. "Boss got married. Boys, come meet the new Mrs. Morrison." What followed was a blur of introductions, congratulations, and good-natured ribbing as the ranch hands welcomed Margaret with genuine enthusiasm. She could tell that these men respected Jake deeply, and their acceptance of her felt like another gift in a journey filled with unexpected blessings. As evening fell and the men returned to their quarters, Jake and Margaret stood on the porch of their home, looking out over the valley that would be their world. Margaret finally opened Emma's gift, a small silver locket containing a photograph of her and Emma as children, and a note that read, "For my brave sister, who taught me that. Love is worth every risk. Start your own traditions now." Jake pulled his wife close, and Margaret marveled at how naturally the word wife had begun to feel. "Any regrets, Mrs. Morrison?" Margaret looked out at the star-filled sky, at the mountains that would guard their home, at the man whose love had given her courage to transform her entire life. "Only one," she said softly. Jake's expression grew concerned. "What's that?" "I regret that we have to wait until tomorrow to really begin our life together. I'm impatient to see what we can build." "Here?" Jake's laughter echoed across the valley. "In that case, Mrs. Morrison, I suggest we start building right now." As they walked into their home together, Margaret thought about the train conductor who had tried to humiliate her, not knowing that his cruelty would lead to the greatest happiness of her life. Sometimes the worst moments become doorways to the best ones, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say, "That's not right," to change everything. The woman who had boarded that train in Denver had been invisible to herself, convinced she was destined for a life of quiet loneliness. The woman who walked into the Morrison ranch house was a wife, a partner, an entrepreneur, ready to build something magnificent in the Colorado wilderness. Margaret Morrison settled into her new life with the confidence of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. She had found her place in the world at last, not in a city or a town, but in the infinite possibilities that stretched out before them like the endless western horizon. Their story had begun with shame and rejection, but it was ending with hope, love, and the promise of a lifetime of adventures yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.